The screams that shattered the quiet afternoon of September 13th, 2018, in rural Lumpkin County, Georgia, would echo through a community for years to come. Trinity Poague, a 21-year-old woman with a pageant crown in her past and a smile that had once charmed judges across the state, stood in her kitchen with blood on her hands and a story that would unravel into one of the most disturbing cases of child murder the region had ever witnessed. Emergency dispatchers received a frantic call that day, a voice trembling with what seemed like panic, reporting an unthinkable tragedy involving a 2-year-old child. But what really happened inside that home? Why would a young woman who had once represented beauty and grace become the center of such darkness? The answers would prove far more complex and chilling than anyone could have imagined, revealing layers of deception, manipulation, and a capacity for violence that left even seasoned investigators struggling to comprehend the depths of human cruelty. Trinity Poague hadn't always been associated with tragedy and horror. Growing up in the mountains of North Georgia, she had been the kind of girl who seemed destined for something more than the rural community could offer. She competed in beauty pageants throughout her teenage years, winning titles and collecting ribbons that her family displayed with pride. Friends from high school remembered her as ambitious, someone who talked about moving to bigger cities, maybe Atlanta or even Nashville, to pursue modeling or acting. She had the looks, they said, the kind of all-American beauty that pageant judges rewarded with tiaras and sashes. But somewhere between those glittering stages and the September day that would define her forever, something had shifted. After graduating high school, Trinity's life had taken a different turn than anyone expected. Instead of heading to college or pursuing those big city dreams, she had stayed in Lumpkin County, taking odd jobs and eventually finding work as a babysitter and nanny for local families. It was work she seemed good at, or at least that's what parents thought when they left their children in her care. She had a way with kids, they said, patient and attentive, the kind of caregiver who sent updates throughout the day and always had the house cleaned up before parents returned home. But behind that carefully maintained facade, was there something darker lurking? Had there been signs that everyone missed? Red flags that only became obvious in hindsight? The relationship between Trinity and the family whose toddler would die in her care had begun innocently enough several months before that fateful September day. The parents, whose names would be protected throughout the legal proceedings that followed, were a young couple trying to balance work and raising their energetic 2-year-old son. They needed reliable childcare, and Trinity had come highly recommended by other families in the area. She was affordable, available, and seemed genuinely fond of children. The arrangement started with just a few hours here and there, then gradually expanded to several full days each week as the parents' work schedules demanded more time away from home. The little boy, with his bright eyes and infectious giggle, had seemed happy in Trinity's care during those first months. She would send photos to his parents showing him playing with toys, eating snacks, or napping peacefully. Everything appeared normal, even ideal. The parents felt fortunate to have found someone so trustworthy. But what was really happening during those long hours when Trinity was alone with the child? Were there moments of frustration that escalated into something more dangerous? Did she possess a temper that only emerged when no witnesses were around to see it? The investigation that would follow would attempt to answer these questions, peeling back the layers of Trinity's double life to reveal a woman very different from the caring nanny she pretended to be. September 13th began like any other Thursday for the family. The parents dropped their son off at Trinity's home early in the morning, giving him kisses goodbye as he clutched his favorite stuffed animal. They had no reason for concern, no premonition that they would never speak to their child again. Trinity took the boy inside, and for several hours everything seemed routine. She texted the child's mother a photo around mid-morning, showing him playing with blocks on the living room floor. But sometime in the hours that followed, something went terribly wrong. What happened next would be pieced together from forensic evidence, autopsy reports, and Trinity's own contradictory statements to police. The emergency call came in at 2:17 in the afternoon. Trinity's voice on the recording alternated between hysterical sobbing and a strange, almost detached calmness that would later unsettle everyone who heard it. She told the dispatcher that the little boy had fallen, that he wasn't breathing, that there was blood everywhere. She begged them to send help immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes, rushing into the house to find a scene that none of them would ever forget. The toddler was lying on the kitchen floor, his small body covered in injuries that were immediately recognizable as far more severe than any simple fall could have caused. They worked frantically to revive him, performing CPR and rushing him to the ambulance. But the child's injuries were catastrophic. He was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital, and it was there that doctors first began to question Trinity's story about an accidental fall. The medical examiner's report would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case against Trinity Poague, and its findings were absolutely damning. The 2-year-old had suffered multiple skull fractures, severe brain trauma, broken ribs, and internal injuries consistent with being beaten repeatedly and with tremendous force. The pattern of injuries indicated that the child had been struck multiple times, likely with an object, as well as with fists or feet. There were also older bruises in various stages of healing, suggesting that this wasn't the first time the boy had been injured in Trinity's care. The medical examiner concluded unequivocally that these injuries could not have resulted from a simple fall, as Trinity had claimed. Instead, they were consistent with severe, sustained physical abuse. The findings were so clear-cut that investigators immediately shifted their focus from a tragic accident to a homicide investigation. But why? What could possibly motivate someone to inflict such horrific violence on a defenseless child? As detectives began interviewing Trinity, they found a young woman who seemed to have multiple versions of events, each one shifting as evidence contradicted her previous statements. In her first interview, conducted while still at the hospital, Trinity maintained that the boy had simply fallen while playing. But when confronted with the medical evidence that made this explanation impossible, her story began to change in disturbing ways. Trinity's second version of events, given during a lengthy interrogation at the Lumpkin County Sheriff's Office, painted a picture of a caregiver overwhelmed and frustrated by a difficult child. She claimed that the toddler had been misbehaving that day, throwing tantrums, refusing to eat, and generally being more challenging than usual. She admitted to losing her temper, to grabbing him roughly and shaking him when he wouldn't stop crying, but she insisted that she hadn't meant to hurt him seriously, that she had just wanted him to be quiet, to behave, to give her a moment of peace. Detectives, however, weren't buying this explanation. The severity of the child's injuries went far beyond a moment of frustration or even a rough shaking. This was sustained, brutal violence inflicted on a tiny, helpless human being who depended on Trinity for protection. As the interrogation continued, Trinity's emotional state fluctuated wildly. She would cry and apologize, then moments later seem almost indifferent, discussing the events with a detachment that chilled the investigators. Psychologists who later reviewed the interrogation tapes would note signs of possible personality disorders, an inability to fully comprehend or take responsibility for the enormity of what she had done. But was Trinity genuinely unable to understand the severity of her actions? Or was this just another layer of manipulation from a young woman who had spent years crafting a false image of herself? The community's reaction to Trinity's arrest was a mixture of shock, horror, and painful reflection. How had they all been so wrong about her? Parents who had trusted her with their own children felt sick with guilt and fear, wondering if their kids had also been mistreated without their knowledge. Several families came forward with concerns they had previously dismissed as minor, odd behaviors, or incidents that now took on sinister new meanings in light of what had happened. One mother reported that her daughter had come home with unexplained bruises after spending a day with Trinity, but she had accepted Trinity's explanation that the child had fallen while playing outside. Another parent mentioned that their son had become unusually clingy and anxious after being in Trinity's care for several weeks, crying whenever it was time to go to her house, but they had attributed it to normal separation anxiety rather than fear of his caregiver. These stories, once fragmented and dismissed, now formed a disturbing pattern that suggested the murdered toddler may not have been Trinity's only victim. Even if he was the only one who hadn't survived her care, the revelation that a beauty queen, someone who had represented their community at pageants across the state, could be capable of such monstrous acts forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about the masks people wear and how little we truly know about those around us. Trinity's family struggled to reconcile the granddaughter and daughter they thought they knew with the person now facing murder charges. Her grandmother, who had been her biggest supporter during her pageant years, told local media that she couldn't believe Trinity was capable of such violence, that there must be some mistake or misunderstanding. But as evidence mounted and details emerged, even Trinity's staunchest defenders found their faith shaken. The trial of Trinity Poague began nearly 2 years after the murder. delayed by COVID-19 pandemic restrictions and multiple motions from her defense team. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming, building a picture of a young woman who had presented a false image to the world while harboring a capacity for shocking violence. They called medical experts who walked the jury through the toddler's injuries in excruciating detail, explaining how each fracture, each contusion, each internal wound had been inflicted, and the tremendous force required to cause such damage to a small child. The testimony was often graphic and difficult to hear, with several jurors visibly emotional as photographs of the victim's injuries were displayed. The prosecution also presented Trinity's evolving statements to police, highlighting the contradictions in the way her story changed each time she was confronted with evidence that disproved her previous claims. They argued that this pattern of deception demonstrated consciousness of guilt, that Trinity knew exactly what she had done and had tried desperately to avoid responsibility. Perhaps most damaging was testimony from other parents who had employed Trinity as a caregiver, several of whom now reported incidents and concerns that they had previously dismissed, but which now suggested a pattern of rough handling and anger toward children in her care. One particularly emotional moment came when the murdered child's mother took the stand, describing her son's personality, his love of dinosaurs and singing, and the trust she had placed in Trinity. Her testimony humanized the victim in a way that crime scene photos and medical reports could not, reminding everyone in the courtroom that behind all the legal terminology and forensic evidence was a real child who had been loved and whose life had been stolen. The defense strategy was perhaps the most controversial aspect of the trial, attempting to paint Trinity as a victim herself, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. Her attorneys argued that she had been dealing with undiagnosed mental health issues, that she had grown up in a difficult environment with her own history of trauma, and that the events of September 13th had been a tragic loss of control rather than a deliberate act of murder. They brought in psychological experts who testified about Trinity's emotional immaturity, her difficulty managing stress, and possible personality disorders that might have impaired her judgment and impulse control. The defense also attempted to suggest that some of the child's injuries might have occurred before September 13, possibly even in his parents' care, though this line of argument was quickly shut down by the prosecution's rebuttal witnesses. Trinity herself took the stand in her own defense, a risky move that ultimately may have sealed her fate. During her testimony, she again claimed that she hadn't meant to seriously hurt the child, that everything had spiraled out of control so quickly that she was sorry and wished she could take it all back. But under cross-examination, the prosecutor methodically dismantled her testimony, pointing out inconsistencies with her previous statements and forcing her to confront the physical evidence that contradicted her version of events. There was a particularly devastating exchange where the prosecutor asked Trinity to demonstrate on a doll how she claimed the injuries had occurred, and her reenactment was immediately recognizable as impossible to have caused the documented trauma. Perhaps most damaging was Trinity's demeanor on the stand, an effect that struck many observers as more concerned with her own situation than genuinely remorseful about the child's death. She cried at times, but her tears seemed performative, similar to how she might have emoted during a pageant talent competition, playing to an audience rather than expressing genuine grief. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty of malice murder, felony murder, cruelty to children in the first degree, and aggravated assault. The speed of their decision suggested that the evidence had been overwhelming, that despite the defense's attempts to generate sympathy or reasonable doubt, the facts of the case were simply too clear. Trinity showed little reaction as the verdicts were read, sitting stone-faced at the defense table, while behind her, the victim's family wept with relief and grief. The sentencing hearing, held several weeks later, brought additional testimony about the impact of the crime on the victim's family and community. The child's father, who had remained mostly silent throughout the trial, finally spoke, describing the hole left in their family by their son's death, the guilt they felt for having trusted Trinity, and the life sentences they themselves were serving through their grief. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, spoke at length about the particularly heinous nature of the crime, the vulnerability of the victim, and the betrayal of trust inherent in Trinity's actions. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never have the opportunity to harm another child. As deputies led Trinity from the courtroom in shackles, observers noted that the beauty queen who had once walked across stages in evening gowns and competed for crowns now shuffled in an orange jumpsuit, Her carefully constructed image finally and completely shattered. The transformation was complete. From pageant winner to convicted child murderer, from someone parents trusted with their most precious treasures to someone who would spend the rest of her life behind bars. The aftermath of Trinity Poague's conviction rippled through Lumpkin County and beyond in ways both expected and surprising. The case prompted new scrutiny of childcare regulations in Georgia, with legislators proposing stricter background check requirements and oversight for in-home daycare providers and nannies. Parents became more vigilant, more questioning, sometimes to the point of paranoia about who they allowed to care for their children. The true crime community fixated on the case, drawn by the contrast between Trinity's pageant past and her horrific crime, producing countless podcasts, YouTube videos, and articles attempting to understand how someone who seemed so normal, even exceptional, could commit such an act. Psychologists and criminologists debated whether Trinity's crime represented a planned act of violence or a loss of control, whether she was fundamentally different from other people, or whether, given the right circumstances and stressors, anyone might be capable of such darkness. The question that haunted many was whether there had been a way to prevent this tragedy, whether signs had been missed, whether better systems or more awareness might have saved the little boy's life. Trinity's family struggled with their own guilt and confusion, some maintaining her innocence despite the conviction, others quietly accepting that the person they thought they knew had never really existed. The murdered child's family faced the impossible task of rebuilding their lives around an absence that could never be filled, navigating grief counseling and support groups while also dealing with the public nature of their tragedy. But perhaps the most unsettling legacy of the case was the way it forced people to confront the reality that monsters don't always look like monsters, that someone can smile for cameras and win pageants and seem perfectly normal while harboring the capacity to kill a defenseless child. Trinity Poague's case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting appearances, about the importance of vigilance when it comes to children's safety, and about the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the worst threats come from the people who seem the most trustworthy. So what lessons can be drawn from the tragic story of Trinity Poague and the toddler whose life she stole? How do we balance the need to trust caregivers with the reality that some people are skilled at deception? What warning signs should parents watch for? And how can communities better protect vulnerable children from those who might harm them? These questions don't have easy answers, but the case provides some guidance for those willing to look honestly at what happened and why. Experts recommend that parents conduct thorough background checks on any caregiver, including criminal records, references from multiple previous employers, and even social media histories that might reveal concerning attitudes or behaviors. They emphasize the importance of drop-in visits and surveillance cameras, not because most caregivers are dangerous, but because the ones who are will be deterred by oversight. Parents should also pay close attention to their children's reactions to caregivers, taking seriously any reluctance, fear, or behavioral changes that coincide with time spent in someone's care. Children often can't articulate what's wrong, but their behavior speaks volumes for those who know how to listen. The case also highlights the need for better mental health resources and support for young adults like Trinity, who may be struggling with issues that make them unsafe around children, but who manage to hide their problems until something tragic happens. And perhaps most importantly, the story of Trinity Poague reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself, that people who commit monstrous acts can look and seem just like everyone else, and that protecting children requires constant vigilance rather than comfortable assumptions. If you found this deep dive into one of the most disturbing cases in recent Georgia history compelling, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more true crime content that goes beyond the headlines to explore the psychology and circumstances behind shocking crimes. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on the Trinity Poague case and what you think it teaches us about trust, deception, and the protection of vulnerable children. And hit that like button if you appreciate the thorough research and respectful approach we take to these difficult stories. The case of the beauty queen turned killer serves as a permanent reminder that appearances can be fatally deceiving and that the price of misplaced trust can be impossibly high.